Thank you all for coming tonight. I always ask if there are any people here for the first time. I'd like to know who you are, tell us who you are, and how you heard about us. I see no new faces, so I guess there are no new people here. Before I start tonight and make a few announcements, I want to pay special tribute to somebody who's done a lot of work for the World War II Book Club and has remained very much under the radar, which is her wish, but it's not going to be her wish for very long, because I want everybody to know what a job she did for us when she prepared a multi-page brochure about the World War II Book Club.
Wow.
Tells a little bit about the history of who we are, the mission statement, gives the names of the recent speakers. Not all of them, there's not enough room. And they are available for viewing on video by going to the World War II Book Club website. So, Marie Summers, where are you? Thank you so much for what you've done. I have a couple of extra copies here tonight. If anybody wants to grab one, you're welcome to. I'll leave them up here. She really did a magnificent job. She led me through it. All I did was give her the information, and she plugged it in, and she's an expert. She knows what she's doing. Another little tidbit of information I want to pass on, because I'm very proud of it. My son, Mark McLaughlin, who's a doctor, has always been interested in history, and he has given several lectures at the Naval Academy and at West Point. And in his connections with his lectures at West Point, he has talked to the people up there about General Wedemeyer, who is known to them, but most of them don't really know what General Wedemeyer really did. Long story short, Mark, at his own expense, has funded, and a lecture series will start. I don't know the exact name of it yet. It's going to start sometime next spring. But it will be the General Albert Wedemeyer Strategic Lecture Series, and we're going to host talks or panels by experts in the field of strategy, which perhaps we need in this day and age when these ragtag militia are making the best-looking armies in the world look pretty bad. So the idea is that thinking along the lines of what General Wedemeyer had, the same principles could be and should be applied perhaps to some of the world situations that we're now facing. And I have to thank my son Mark for that. Two future programs which will close out this season. May 19, Bruce Tucker, he's been here a couple of times. He's going to talk about Operation Storm. I didn't even know what this was when he told me about it. But the Japanese produced a submarine aircraft carrier, believe it or not, during World War II. I don't know how much action it saw, and I don't know what happened to it, but we'll find out on May 19. On June 23, I'm going to have Pat Schuber, who's going to lecture on Operation Anthropoid. This is a fascinating story. It was a combined British-Czech covert operation which resulted in the death of Reinhard Heydrich, the highest-ranking Nazi assassinated during the war. The Germans unleashed horrendous and extreme retaliation, including, but not limited to, killing every person in the town and bulldozing the town absolutely flat. The town of Ladice was bulldozed and is now represented by a plaque setting forth what happened that night. Okay, on tonight's program, we are very honored and pleased to have with us David Kaiser, who, with Rich Rosenthal and Steve Lemaizo, we saw lecture last year at the FDR Library about the book he's going to talk about tonight. David has taught history at Harvard, Carnegie Mellon, the Naval War College, Williams College. He's the author of 7 books, including The Road to Dallas, The Assassination of John F. Kennedy, and of course the book he's going to talk about tonight. David is a graduate of Harvard History Department, BA, and received a PhD from Harvard also in 1976. He's a veteran, military, Army, Reserve. He's married, has 2 children, both boys. One 36 years old who is in Bogota, Colombia, working as a legal gambling specialist or something like that. What is it, David?
At the moment, he's running a sports book, too.
Okay. All right.
But yes, it's perfectly legal.
And the baby of the family, just married. He's a principal of a charter school in Brooklyn.
Wow.
Now, the book David's going to talk about tonight, No End Save Victory, How FDR Led the Nation into War, is not, and I repeat, is not, as some have mistakenly been led to believe, simply by the title, is a story about how Franklin Roosevelt tricked and finagled us into the United States, into the war that we did not want. It's not about that. Indeed, the story is about a man who would have done anything to keep the United States out of war, but circumstances beyond his control made war inevitable. And it's a story about how FDR skillfully built up our armed forces and prepared us for the inevitable. It's a story further about the step-by-step process covering the short period of May 1940 to the start of the war, December 1941. David tells us about FDR's indirect methods of managing people. FDR has to restrain those who wanted to drag us into the war until the time was right. But he had to enlist these people's passion and experience in mobilizing for war. At the same time, he had to win over the isolationists, a big job. He could do this only by letting the flow of events outside our hemisphere erode isolationist resistance. This was a Herculean task, and the fact that FDR was successful validates the premise even more. We don't have any books of David to sell tonight because the hard copies have been sold out, but the paperback is about to come out, and David said he was going to bring some book plates. Did you bring?
Ah.
Oh, you forgot.
Sorry.
Okay, he was going to bring some.
Actually, I had some, I think, but they're at the hotel. Oh, I feel very
Okay.
bad about that.
Must have been my fault. He was going to bring some book plates, which he could sign for anybody, which if you bought the book, you could paste it in.
But I will be glad to do that anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
We can arrange that. Yeah.
I read this book. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. And please welcome David Kaiser.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you all for coming out. I see that the audience is composed largely of people old enough to remember the war, and perhaps some even old enough to have participated in it. I will just mention before I begin another remarkable book by a contemporary of many of yours, now 92, I think, that I just finished during another trip over the weekend. It is called Even This I Get to Experience, and it is the autobiography of Norman Lear, best known as the producer of a number of television shows 30 years ago, including All in the Family and The Jeffersons and Maude and many more. He had a remarkable life, a very remarkable life, which he details in great detail, including his own military service as a gunner in a B-17. But that is just an aside. I'm surprised the book didn't sell more copies or get more attention because it really is an amazing book. Now, as John said, No End Save Victory focuses on a critical 18-month period from May of 1940, when the United States was really confronted with an immediate danger to the Western Hemisphere and the United States itself, to December 1941, when the war began. And it shows how during that period, both our objectives evolved, first from hemispheric defense into a plan to actually win the Second World War against Germany, Italy, and Japan. And secondly, how Roosevelt and his administration began to plan to expand our military and our productive capacity to be able to secure not only the first objective, but the second one. But as I have done in my last several books, I also tried to put this story in a very broad context of American history, really going back to the beginning. Since the 18th century, it is a fact that American history has been punctuated every 80 years or so by a great crisis that destroyed an old order and created a new one. The first of those crises was the era of the American Revolution and the Constitution, roughly from 1774 until the early 1790s. The second was the Civil War, of course, in which the nation had to fight what is still its biggest war to keep itself together. And the third was the Great Depression and the Second World War, and it is on that period, of course, that this book is focused. Now, that rhythm was identified specifically about 20 years ago by two brilliant amateur historians named William Strauss and Neil Howe in two books, the first one called Generations, The History of America's Future, and the second called The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy. And Strauss and Howe not only wrote those books about the past, but they did the math in the early 1990s, and they concluded and argued that during the first 15 years of the 21st century, we would experience another great crisis along on the same scale, or a comparable scale to those earlier ones, and that once again we would emerge as a completely different nation from that crisis. I personally feel that that prediction has been borne out, although the crisis we are going through is not turning out either as they had hoped or as I had hoped, but I think they identified a real phenomenon. What is equally important, however, and it was, as I say, 20 years ago that I first became aware of this idea and began to integrate it into my own thinking, is that it turns out that Strauss and Howe were not the first people to see this rhythm in American history, and another man who did was, in fact, Franklin Roosevelt. On more than one occasion, he specifically compared the period through which he was leading the nation to the period of the Revolution and to the period of the Civil War. He said specifically that the nation now faced tasks on the same scale. Most of all, it is very clear, as I hope to show you, that he knew that not only America but the whole world was at a turning point, that what we did both at home and abroad was going to have very far-reaching consequences and was going to shape the world for a long time to come. And because of the wisdom of his decisions and the effectiveness with which his contemporaries and younger generations carried them out, he really did successfully create the world in which all of us have spent the remainder of our lives. So I'm going to go through the main points of the actual decisions leading to war, beginning with the spring of 1940. But I'm also going to spend some time, about 2/3 of the way through the talk, on how this whole period fit into American history and compare how FDR and his contemporaries handled their crisis, very briefly, with how we are handling or not handling the one that we face today. So let's begin with a little background and Roosevelt's response to the world crisis as it began to develop in the late 30s during his second term. Now, as many of you will remember, in his second acceptance speech in 1936, Roosevelt stated that this generation, presumably meaning his own, about which I will have more to say, has a rendezvous with destiny. We all know that quote. Very few of us know what came next. Certainly I didn't until I began researching the book. But let's see what he meant by that. In this world of ours, in other lands, Roosevelt said, there are some people who in times past have lived and fought for freedom and seem to have grown too weary to carry on the fight. They have yielded their democracy. I believe in my heart that only our success can stir their ancient hope. They begin to know that here in America, we are waging a great and successful war. We are fighting to save a great and precious form of government for ourselves and for the world. So that even then, in 1936, with fascism in power in Italy, National Socialism in Germany and communism in the Soviet Union, Roosevelt understood that what he was doing in the United States was not only saving democracy here at home, but potentially saving it for the world. And the war to which he referred clearly might, within the foreseeable future, become a real war, as indeed it did. Now, a year later, in 1937, the first major conflict of this period, the Sino-Japanese War, broke out. And a few months later, in September of 1937, Roosevelt gave the sensational quarantine speech in Chicago, which I'll return to a little bit later, in which he declared that a contagion of lawlessness was spreading around the world, and that if it could not be stopped, it was bound to reach the Western Hemisphere. Now, Roosevelt had a remarkable press conference a day or two later. He had referred to the need to quarantine aggression. And the press, naturally, wanted to know what he meant. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was a remarkable man as a communicator, both when he wanted to communicate and when he didn't. And if he didn't want you to know exactly what was going on in his mind, neither waterboarding nor repeated questioning was going to get it out of him, I assure you. And I quoted that press conference in full. It's about a page in the book, because it is a splendid example of his determination to say absolutely nothing as to what the quarantine might mean. But it turned out, I discovered, that it meant something very specific, which he tried to pursue over the next few months. He wanted to enlist the British government to establish some sort of distant blockade of Japan to force them to end the war in China and return to lawful ways in international affairs. And he sent a high-ranking naval officer to London to discuss this at the turn of the year 1937-38. However, Neville Chamberlain's government was not interested, and the idea didn't go anywhere. The next climactic event, about 9 months later in 1938, was the Munich crisis, in which, under the threat of war, France and Britain gave in to Hitler and handed him a large chunk of Czechoslovakia. It was assumed that they had done so because they could not have beaten Germany in a war, and it is clear that Roosevelt and many other leading figures in his administration began to worry that war was going to break out within a relatively short time and that Hitler was going to win. And indeed, by early 1939, Roosevelt had asked the Joint Board, what was then the parallel institution to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, although it was much, much smaller. That's one of the fascinating things about this story, is how tiny groups of men in Washington, by today's standards, planned the greatest war in history. He asked the Joint Board to prepare a war plan to defend the Western Hemisphere against a coalition of Germany, Italy, and Japan without any allies. In other words, a plan to cope with the contingency that the British and French had either been defeated or had been intimidated into standing aside. And in fact, that plan was ready by the middle of 1939. And it was just that, a defense plan. It did not call for any conquest of Germany or Japan. And critically, then the war did break out in September, and by April and May, the Germans appeared to be winning it in Europe, and the contingency foreseen by that plan seemed to be on the point of coming to pass. And this brings us to the first phase of my story, which runs roughly from May and June of 1940 on the one hand, until the German attack on the Soviet Union in June of 1941. The events of the spring of 1940 were revolutionary. In April, the Germans not only occupied Denmark, but they did something which would have been thought to have been impossible given British naval superiority. They managed to get troops into Norway, then to get aircraft into Norway, and to conquer that whole country within about a month. The British also took some losses from German aircraft, and it began to look, for the first time, but not for the last in this war, as though there had been a real revolution in military affairs, in that air power, in which Germany was thought to be superior, now trumped sea power. And then in May and June came the German attack on the Low Countries in France and the fall of all three of those countries. The invasion and defeat of Britain was threatened. Both were certainly expected by many leading figures in Washington, and Roosevelt certainly thought that the invasion of Britain was a contingency with which he had to reckon. Okay. The real nightmare that was troubling American planners had to do with the situation at sea. The purpose of the American Navy in the interwar period had been to fight the Japanese in the Pacific, and that was it. It was assumed that the British would handle things in the Atlantic and that we didn't have to worry about things there. Now, we faced the possibility not only that the British and the French might be defeated, but that the Germans and the Italians might take over large parts of the British and French navies, leaving them in a position of overwhelming naval superiority against the United States. And thus, the specific fear that dominated thinking in Washington was that Hitler would be able to move across the Atlantic. There is a map here in No End Save Victory. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have PowerPoint tonight, which I specifically commissioned from the publisher, showing the Atlantic, and I insisted that it not be a Mercator projection, the kind of projection we've looked at all our lives, because the Mercator projection makes the North Atlantic look absolutely gigantic. But the point is, what they were worried about was that the Germans might easily go from Norway, possibly into the British Isles, but at any rate to Iceland, then to Greenland, then to Labrador and Newfoundland, and at that point they would be within easy bombing range of the United States. The other possibility, after the fall of France, that troubled everybody a great deal for at least the next year and a half, was that Hitler might send forces through the Iberian Peninsula, where Portugal and Spain were neutral, but more or less friendly to him, across the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa and all the way to Dakar in West Africa, which is less than 2,000 miles from Brazil. There were plenty of fascist movements in South America. There was plenty of sympathy for Italy and Germany in South America. And the possibility of a combined military political offensive there was very real as well. So it was at this point that steps had to be taken to secure the Western Hemisphere, particularly steps in the field of production, which Roosevelt knew from the beginning was going to be decisive. And decisive steps were taken at sea, in the air, and on land during that spring and summer. To begin with, in June, a bill was rushed through Congress that was really quite extraordinary. A bill to practically double the size of the American Navy with new construction within the next 5 or 6 years. This was often referred to as the two-ocean Navy. And as I say, this went through the Congress with practically no opposition and practically no debate, which makes a very important point about how Americans at this moment saw the world. You've all heard a great deal about isolationism in these days, and that's true. Isolationism was a powerful political force, both on the left and on the right. And actually, one of the most prominent forces from September 1939 until June of 1941 for isolation was the Communist Party, since Stalin at this point was an ally of Hitler under the Nazi-Soviet Pact. But that was only one. However, what the passage of the Naval Expansion Act shows is that there was really almost no dissent among Americans, that we were living in an extremely dangerous world, and that we had to prepare to defend the Western Hemisphere. Thus, this step was taken, and eventually the ships that were built under that act were the ships that undertook the great offensives in the Pacific in 1944 and 1945. But that was the problem. Building warships took a long time. Most of these weren't going to be ready for quite a while. Secondly, Roosevelt suddenly, and on his own initiative, in an address to the nation in May of 1940, called for the production of up to 50,000 military aircraft per year within a couple of years. A fantastic figure. The Army Air Corps had no idea what they would do with that many planes. We couldn't build more than a few thousand a year at that point. But this was typical of him to lay down the target and to challenge everyone else to come up with it. And last but not least, after a summer of debate and considerably more hesitation, it was decided in September that we would have a peacetime draft for the first time. And the National Guard had been mobilized, and now young men were being drafted. But the draft was passed with two very interesting limitations on it. First of all, the young men were being drafted for only 1 year. After that, they were supposed to go home. That created a crisis in the middle of 1941 when it was clear that that would not work. Secondly, no draftee was to be sent outside the Western Hemisphere. This draft force was purely for the purpose of defending the Western Hemisphere, and that was all. Now, the war plans that were now redone, again, focused entirely on the defense of the Western Hemisphere. And so did the next big step that Roosevelt took, the destroyer deal with Britain in September of 1940. Roosevelt yielded to desperate pleas from Winston Churchill, who said that Britain was being threatened with invasion or being starved out, and agreed to give the British 50 older destroyers on the spot. In return, he received the right to establish bases in a chain of British possessions in the Western Hemisphere, running from Newfoundland in the north, and incidentally, Newfoundland was not part of Canada at that time. It was a British colony. To Bermuda in the middle of the Atlantic, and then down to St. Lucia and Trinidad in the south. And this was not just window dressing so that Roosevelt could tell the American people that he had gotten something in return. This was very serious. Work began on bases on those islands for American forces immediately. What Roosevelt was doing was extending our defense perimeter out into the Atlantic to meet the contingency that would arise if Britain fell. As it turned out, the British did very well in the air. In the Battle of Britain, Hitler decided not to attempt the invasion, but it was still anticipated that there would be an invasion in early 1941 and that it would probably be successful. And in that same month of September, there were also two new critical developments which I think are the most important to understand Roosevelt's attitude towards getting into the war during the next 18 months. The first was the signature of the tripartite pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan, which essentially said, almost if in so many words, if the United States becomes involved in war with any one of us, we will all go to war with the United States. There was, in short, after the signature of the tripartite pact, no possibility of fighting on only one front in the Atlantic or the Pacific. We would have to fight both, and as Roosevelt once remarked on the phone to Harold Ickes about 8 months later, I just don't have enough ships to go around. We were not prepared for that war. And the second thing that happened in September was that Roosevelt got a report from the Army Chief, General Marshall, and Admiral Stark, the Navy Chief, called The Problem of Munitions in Relation to the World Crisis. And it was a chilling report because what it said was that it would be approximately 18 months, that is until sometime in 1942, before the United States had enough munitions to undertake any sustained combat operations anywhere. There is a myth out there that Roosevelt wanted to get into the war as soon as possible and that it took him 18 months to do so to bring the American people along. I'm convinced that that is false. Roosevelt was terrified that he would be forced into the war long before we were ready to fight it and that we would be defeated. And that, as much as anything else, as I'll explain in a moment, explains what he did and did do during late 1940 and the first half of 1941. Our great luck was that Hitler did not decide to advance into North Africa or into the Atlantic. Instead, by late 1940, he had decided that the next major operation would be the invasion of the Soviet Union, and he promised the Navy, who was very keen to move into the Atlantic, his Navy, that after that they would get all they wanted and more. Meanwhile came the 1940 election. I enjoyed writing about that a great deal. Wendell Willkie, the Republican, was a good opponent for Roosevelt in one respect. He did not make foreign policy much of an issue. he shared Roosevelt's goals, namely to prepare the nation and to assist the British when possible, while not advocating immediate intervention. Wilkie's main argument was that Roosevelt had to be defeated for his third term because if he were successful, he would establish a totalitarian government here in the US, and this would be the last election that the United States ever had. Wilkie was evidently not able to persuade the American people of that. But I do want to mention one point, which is rather fascinating, about the attitudes of the American people toward the third term and toward Roosevelt. Gallup had begun polling scientifically in the mid-30s, and we have a lot of polling data about just about anything from then on. And one thing they started polling about in 1939 was the third term, 38 or 39. And initially, the results were very clear. A majority of those polled, A, didn't think Roosevelt would run for a third term, and B, said they wouldn't vote for him if he did. But that changed almost overnight in September of 1939 after the war in Europe broke out. After that, majority said both that they expected him to run for a third term and that they would vote for him. He was the man, evidently, that the American people trusted to lead them through the world crisis. As it turned out, despite the opposition of nearly all the major newspapers in the United States, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, Roosevelt was reelected by a substantial margin, not the nearly total landslide he'd won in 1936, but still a very big margin in November. And at that point, there was an interesting debate, in effect, within the administration, and Roosevelt's near-term plans became clear. The first thing that happened after the election was that Admiral Stark, the head of the Navy, who was very close to Roosevelt, wrote what became known as the Plan Dog Memorandum, a strategic appreciation with recommendations, which was very carefully reasoned, went on for quite a while, but it boiled down to a plea to get into the war as soon as possible in order to try to save the British. Stark laid out various possibilities for the war, and he said that if Britain were defeated, while we might not lose everywhere, we would probably not win anywhere. And it was clear, I think, from the memorandum that he thought we should be in as soon as possible. But Roosevelt evidently did not agree. Instead, he introduced, in the last days of December, to the American people and then the Congress, the Lend-Lease program, a program to give an unlimited amount of war material produced in the United States to the British or to anybody else whom he felt needed it in the best interest of the defense of the United States. Now, this was an attempt to help British morale. It could be seen as a help to have the British win the war in the long run. Certainly that was the way Churchill saw it. But Lend-Lease wasn't going to provide anything substantial for the British during the next 6 months, when a successful invasion of Britain was still very much expected in the United States. What Lend-Lease gave Roosevelt, when it was eventually passed after a lengthy debate, was a new excuse for a new drastic expansion of the production capacity of the United States. Roosevelt had already set up new institutions in Washington to handle that expansion. I'll be talking about this more. There were a series of agencies with roughly the same personnel whose name changed every 6 months. Originally it was called the Defense Commission. Then at the turn of the year 4041, it became the Office of Production Management. But in any case, this was being planned, and there was a lot of thinking going on about the long-term needs of the war economy, needs in raw materials, needs in machine tools, how this would affect the civilian economy, and so on. But Lend-Lease meant that everything would get quite a bit bigger, although nobody knew how much bigger. Roosevelt clearly expressed himself in a small meeting in the White House in January 1941, when he said that while making this long-range planning, he insisted to the service chiefs they had to be ready to act with what little we had. And he said if the British go down, it will take the Germans 6 months to mobilize British resources, the British Navy, and so on. So we have to be prepared to fight the Germans 6 months from the moment that the British fall. Now, in fact, of course, there was no invasion of Britain in the first half of 1941, and in fact, we began to get very good intelligence on the possibility of a German attack on the Soviet Union. Still, however, the British were doing very badly against the Germans in North Africa and the Mediterranean, particularly in Greece. At one point in the late spring, after his setbacks there, Churchill made a blunt plea, not for the last time, to Roosevelt to enter the war immediately as practically the only thing that could save Britain. They were now in regular contact, but Roosevelt's reply telegram to that one made no mention of the possibility of the U.S. coming into the war at all. That was not what he was going to do. Meanwhile, Henry M. Stimson, a Republican, formerly Hoover's Secretary of State, whom Roosevelt had brought into the cabinet in a brilliant political move in the spring of 1940, along with another Republican, Frank Knox, as Secretary of the Navy, was pushing, to some extent in public and very much in private, to Roosevelt to get into the war now. He would do this regularly every few months, but Roosevelt refused to go along. The new critical phase, which led to a whole different orientation of our objectives, our strategy, and production plans, began in late June and lasted for through September, really, of 1941. And it began with the German attack on the Soviet Union. Roosevelt, a few days afterwards, was writing a letter to a trusted confidant of his, the former Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral William Leahy, who was now our ambassador in Vichy, France. And Roosevelt wrote, "Now comes this Russian diversion." But he said, if it turns out to be more than a diversion, it offers the prospect of ending German domination of Europe. Roosevelt, in short, realized that the situation had been entirely transformed and new possibilities opened up by the German attack on the Soviet Union. Now, again, most American military authorities, led by General Marshall, didn't think there was any chance that the Soviets were going to last out the year. But Roosevelt did, and he insisted, over their violent objections, on providing the Soviets what aid we could, including desperately needed aircraft, immediately, to show that we were on their side. But that was not all. Again, Stimson said that this would be an excellent moment to enter the war. Roosevelt said no. But he did push forward in the Atlantic. Iceland was occupied in July, taking over the occupation of Iceland from the British. Again, pushing our defense perimeter even more forward. There was a lot of talk about occupying the Azores as well, but that did not come off until much later. And they began discussing in that summer plans to convoy British merchant ships, at least to Iceland, although those didn't go into effect for some time. But the really critical decision made in July had to do, again, with production. A crisis had been brewing for some months over the lack of clear guidance about how big a war we were preparing for. Officially, as I've said repeatedly, the plan was still defense of the Western Hemisphere. The available plans were thought to be sufficient for that, and yet FDR continued calling for more production, more, and everybody needed to know where this was going. Well, in early July, he told them. He gave Stimson a directive to prepare an estimate in the War Department of what it would take to secure the defeat of all our possible enemies in a war. And the War Department went right to work on this, led by Lieutenant Colonel Wedemeyer in the War Plans Division. This was going to have very striking results, which I'll discuss in a moment, by September. In short, we were now looking towards a completely new objective, not simply the defense of the Western Hemisphere, but the defeat of Germany and Japan, and planning to put together what it would take to do that. And indeed, the original directives, or it was quickly built into this directive, that the idea was not only to determine what would be necessary, but to see if it could be ready. And please remember this date, by the 1st of July, 1943. Now, meanwhile, the German attack on the Soviet Union had very dramatic impact in the results in the Far East as well. The Japanese, too, recognized this as a decisive event in the World War, which also encouraged them to decide what they were going to do and throw all their chips on the table. The Japanese government debated going into the war against the Soviet Union on the side of the Germans, but partly based on the very unsatisfactory undeclared war they had had with the Soviets a couple of years earlier, they decided against that and decided to wait until the Germans had already defeated the Soviets. Instead, they decided in early July to undertake what they called the southward advance, an invasion of Malaya, the British possession, and Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, what is now Indonesia, and the Philippines, an American possession. And in the record of the decision by the Japanese government, it was stated that Japan was not going to shrink from war with either Britain or the United States to carry out this southward advance. Now, by this time, naval intelligence was already breaking the Japanese diplomatic code. Not their naval or military code, but their diplomatic code. And they picked up unmistakable indications of this decision almost right away. The Japanese also took the first step right away. They had already occupied northern Indochina a year earlier, Indochina being a French colony, and the French now could not defend it. Now they occupied southern Indochina as well, as a stepping stone to the further southward advance. That is what led Roosevelt to give in to the importuning of advisors like Stimson and Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, and embargo all shipments of oil and almost all trade to the Japanese. I would stress, however, that we took that step only after the Japanese had decided on the southward advance, almost certainly involving war with the United States. This led to a last round of talks with the Japanese to see if war could be averted in Washington. We asked them to accept our vision of a peaceful world in which nations would stay within their own borders and to withdraw from Indochina as a first step toward withdrawing from China. They stalled us and we stalled them for several months along these lines, although they had no intention really of giving into those terms. Actually, Prince Konoye, who was at that moment premier in Japan, but who was going to fall in late September, was at some level interested in some kind of a deal with the United States, but he was also committed to the southward advance, and I could find no evidence that he ever would have been in a position to offer terms that we would have accepted. Now, a myth has grown up, once again, that Roosevelt and his administration used the embargo to provoke a Japanese attack as a means of getting us into the war in Europe. But I concluded that this is a complete after-the-fact misunderstanding of the situation based on what we now know. First of all, by the second half of 1941, and as a result of some developments which I'll mention in a moment, we thought that we would be getting into war with Germany at almost any moment because of naval war in the Atlantic. And, this is the key point, we knew from repeated intercepted communications between Tokyo and the Japanese embassy in Washington that the Japanese were totally committed to the Tripartite Pact, that they would not give it up as part of a deal, which is what we were asking them to do, and that therefore, when we got involved in the war in Europe, they would come into the war. End of story. In other words, we assessed correctly that there was no possibility of fighting only in Europe anyway. Thus, there was no reason not to embargo Japan's oil, and to put every obstacle that we could to their further advance. And their determination to attack became only more apparent from more intercepts that we got during the fall. Now, referring to the Atlantic, there were dramatic steps there too. The most dramatic being the meeting with Churchill in the middle of August on British and American warships off Newfoundland, and the issuance of the Atlantic Charter, a plan for the post-war world in which the British and American governments explicitly laid out their vision for a new world, and I quote, "after the destruction of the Nazi tyranny," unquote. In other words, although the United States was not yet in the war, it was formally committed to the complete defeat of Germany. And after that, we began indeed convoying British ships to and from Iceland. And it had been clear to Roosevelt from the beginning that the occupation of Iceland would give us a chance to do that. All this was fully announced to the American people. And shooting incidents involving German submarines immediately resulted, and one American destroyer was eventually sunk. But war did not break out in the Atlantic. It almost did, actually, in an incident that has been uncovered quite recently by a German historian. In early November, I believe, the Germans were sending one of their smaller battleships, the Scheer, into the Atlantic on another commerce raiding trip, such as they had done before with the Bismarck. The British, again, intercepted this through Ultra. We knew about it, and we had a task force of ships ready to meet the Scheer in battle. And had it made it into the Atlantic, I think that would have happened and the war would have begun then and there. As it turned out, though, the Scheer got engine trouble and turned back. So that was not, as it turned out, the beginning. Now then in September came from the War Department the report on the Victory program, which they hoped to have ready, as I said, by July 1, 1943. And it was a staggering program, both in terms of the production of aircraft, ships, and whatever, but the estimate that the United States could put in the field 8.5 million men. At the moment, they were building only to 1.8 million, and there was a vague plan for 4 million. But now there was a potential new objective of 8 million, and even Stimson was rather shocked by that. He ran it by FDR, however, and FDR did not demur. He was in principle on board. The catch was that everybody knew that there was no way to start implementing the Victory program until we were in the war. But once again, I discovered in a press conference that fall, Roosevelt publicly referred to the fact that we were now drawing up, as he put it, an all-out program for maximum effort. There was hardly anything that he did in this period, I discovered, that he did not, in fact, share with the American people in one way or another. Now, okay, so the Victory program was being worked on. It was sitting there. It was not yet formally approved. Now, at this point, before reaching the climax of the story and the outbreak of the war, I'm going to turn to some broader issues regarding Roosevelt as the leader of his administration and the leader of the nation. I focused on Roosevelt in the book as a member of a particular generation, and Strauss and Howe, who came up with this generational theory and divided American history into generations, named them the missionary generation. They were born roughly from 1863 until about 1883. Roosevelt himself was at the end of that generation, born in 1882. Stimson, Knox, the Secretary of War, Hull, the Secretary of State, were all somewhat older than Roosevelt. Stimson was the oldest. He had been born, I think, in 1868. Now, Strauss and Howe argued, and for me this is really held up, that they are a parallel in a sense to my own baby boom generation. I'm not sure how many more of us there are in this room. I suspect there are a few, but not too many. But at any rate, just as we were born in the wake of the Second World War, the missionaries were born in the wake of the Civil War. And the generations that are born in the wake of the Great Crisis have a particular life experience. They grow up in an atmosphere as children in which their parents feel that the great questions of the world have been settled and nothing new remains to be discovered. And these new generations, which they call prophet generations, like the boomers and the missionaries, accept that until they become young adults. At which point, like Adam and Eve in the garden, they eat from the tree of good and evil and decide that they're going to make their own decisions about how things should run. Now, what I discovered about the missionaries, and which I was able to document to some extent, was this. They were growing up in the Gilded Age, a chaotic era dominated by social Darwinism, the law of the jungle, rampant economic growth, etc. And their lifelong mission became to bring order out of this chaos, both at home and abroad. And you see this in the language they used all the time, as I'll show in just a moment. My own boom generation, I'm afraid, took the opposite path. We grew up in a very secure and well-organized world in the 50s and 60s. Our parents, sadly, handed us this golden opportunity to prove that we were right and they were wrong about everything, namely the Vietnam War. And at that point, we adopted our lifelong mission, I'm sad to say, of bringing chaos out of order, the fruits of which are very much in evidence today. But let me just share a little bit of the language that Roosevelt used to bring home what I really want to say about this. Not only were they looking for an ordered world, they were looking for a world ordered according to moral principles. So let's go back to Roosevelt's first inaugural address, Nothing to Fear But Fear Itself, and his description of how we got into this mess. Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money, it lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. The joy and moral stimulation of work no longer must be forgotten in the mad chase of evanescent profits. Now, I would just suggest to you that when Barack Obama took office in 2009, in the midst of the most serious economic crisis since then, although by no means as serious, he did not choose to use language like that. Instead, he treated the problem as kind of a mechanical problem that some tinkering with the system would fix. And history will have a lot of time, I think, to analyze that difference. Again, in 1937, in the quarantine speech, when Roosevelt first tried to warn the nation about foreign danger, he used the same kind of moral language. The landmarks and traditions which have marked the progress of civilization towards a condition of law, order, and justice are being wiped away. Without a declaration of war and without warning or justification of any kind, civilians, including vast numbers of women and children, are being ruthlessly murdered with bombs from the air. In times of so-called peace, ships are now being attacked and sunk by submarines without cause or notice. Nations are fomenting and taking sides in civil warfare, and nations that have never done them any harm. Nations claiming freedom for themselves deny it to others. Innocent peoples, innocent nations are being cruelly sacrificed to a greed for power and supremacy which is devoid of all sense of justice and humane considerations. And Roosevelt continued to use this kind of language all through the war, as did Stimson, Knox, Hull, and all the others. I'll just take a word to talk about Roosevelt's administrative style. He had brought these very strong characters into the administration, and it was certainly a characteristic of the missionary generation that they had a great deal of confidence in their opinion. He encouraged them to speak out. He did not mind when they publicly advocated steps he was not yet willing to take. This was a way to shape public opinion. But he kept matters in his own hands. The relationship between Stimson and Roosevelt was fascinating. They were from the same state, New York. They must have known each other since they were very young men. But Stimson was very frustrated by Roosevelt at the beginning because he felt that he was totally unorganized and that you couldn't get a decision out of him. And yet, as time goes on, by the fall of '41, Stimson is beginning to realize that despite all the frustrating things that conversations he's had with Roosevelt, and the times he felt he couldn't get a decision out of him, things have certainly moved a long way in the direction that he wanted them to go. And I'm sure it continued that way from then on. But the most important thing that Roosevelt had done, starting in 1933, was to enlist the whole nation in a series of crusades. At the beginning, these were crusades to reduce unemployment, to raise farm prices, to tame rivers, to build dams that would create and make available public electric power, and many more. The preparation for the war was the last and greatest of those crusades, and it drew on many New Deal techniques and institutions. It also got all the major elements of American society involved and on board. Roosevelt gave labor, which was growing very rapidly, a key role in planning war production. The civil rights movement, whose great days lay ahead, but which was already a political force, took advantage of all this to secure greater participation for Negroes, as of course they called themselves then, in the armed forces, and also in the booming war economy. What Roosevelt did was to make the relatively excluded groups in American society, not only Negroes, but many relatively recent ethnic immigrants, want to participate in these great national enterprises. And that was how he kept the nation behind them and got them behind him. During the war, that also extended to women, of course, who were drawn by the hundreds of thousands of the millions in the factories. Although, oddly enough, I did not find a single discussion of anything like that in the pre-war period. And Roosevelt's New Deal model of taking responsibility for the economic well-being of the nation, for its growth in all sorts of ways, became the model for the rest of the advanced world in Europe and in Japan after the war as well. And it was in that sense that he really did do what he had laid out in the Rendezvous with Destiny speech and set the model for the world and the way that the world would live in many decades. And that whole sense of being involved together in a national crusade for specific defined objectives is sadly, in my opinion, what we are lacking the most today. And I think that that is going to have consequences that will reverberate through the lives of our children and grandchildren, as well as of our own. So, I'll be glad to take up more of that in the discussion if you want, but it is now time to turn to how war eventually came. At the Atlantic Conference in August, Roosevelt had told Churchill that he would wage war but not declare it. And as I have said, he had begun waging it in the convoys in the Western Atlantic. In September, after shooting incidents between German submarines and American ships, he announced that the shooting had started, but he made no attempt to actually declare war. That made sense, since there was nothing that we could do effectively that we were not already doing, namely convoying halfway across the Atlantic. It was around November 1 that the Japanese decided that they were definitely going to war, not only with the British and the Dutch, but with us. And we intercepted messages to the embassy in Washington, to the negotiators, saying that they had a real deadline at the end of the month, and at that point things were automatically going to happen. The highest levels of the administration continued to fear, however, that the Japanese would simply attack British and Dutch possessions and leave us alone. They discussed this very specifically in at least 2 meetings at the highest levels of the White House. As it turned out, and Roosevelt got the cabinet on board that if the Japanese did do that, if they attacked the British and the Dutch, that we would go into the war then and there. And he told the British ambassador that on the 5th of December, in fact. However, he also knew that there was a good chance that we might be attacked, and he said that on November 25th. Speeches were being prepared to deal with the situation in which we were not attacked. As it turned out, however, we did not have to worry. An attack on the United States had been a part of the Japanese war plan right from the beginning. I can talk a lot about Pearl Harbor and the questioning if you want. it is very interesting that the possibility that the Japanese might begin the war with an attack on Pearl Harbor had been discussed even at the highest levels repeatedly during 1941. So what went wrong? Well, two things, really. First of all, in the days before Pearl Harbor, we knew that the Japanese were mounting a huge expedition to the south, which we'd actually sighted off the coast of Indochina. They were clearly heading for the British possessions and the Dutch East Indies and maybe the Philippines. We did not anticipate that they might be able to do that and make an attack on Pearl Harbor as well. But the biggest reason we were surprised, which I was able to lay out in some detail in the book, was Admiral Kimmel, the commander at Pearl Harbor, who had decided on his own authority and his own initiative, and contrary to the explicit war warning he had gotten from Washington on November 27th, that war was not about to break out. He made that decision, as I say, for his own reasons. He communicated it to an American journalist, someone I later came to know myself, a day or two before Pearl Harbor, and it was for that reason that the fleet was sitting in port unready. Now, we also knew that the Germans were going to come in. That too was from the magic intercepts. Several days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese ambassador in Berlin had told Ribbentrop that there might be dramatic developments in Japan's relations with Britain and the United States at any moment, and what would Germany do? And Ribbentrop had said that, well, I have to talk to the Fuhrer, but I have no doubt that we will be faithful to the tripartite pact, as indeed they were going to. In any case, and here too a good deal of nonsense is being thrown around, there was never any possibility after Pearl Harbor that we were going to only fight Japan. The statements made by Roosevelt on December 9th, by various administration figures from the word go, all said that the Japanese attack was part of a worldwide offensive. They even said that Japan was doing Germany's bidding, and it was clear that we were going to war with Germany as well. As it turned out, Hitler did make things easier for us for declaring war on us first. Now, I've spoken about these leaders as men with a strong moral purpose, but they also had an astonishing ability to make things happen, which is largely what the book was about. And I ended the narrative with an extraordinary exchange on the 9th of December at a meeting of the latest production agency, the Supply Priorities and Allocations Board. The exchange was between Stimson, the Secretary of War, and William Knudsen, who had stepped down as chairman of the board of General Motors to oversee the industrial production for war in Washington. Stimson had for some time been bugging Knudsen on the question of whether the targets in the Victory program could in fact be met as hoped by July 1, 1943. And on the 9th of December in this meeting, Stimson put it to Knudsen, can we do it by July 1, 1943? No, said Knudsen, we can't. But we can do it by July 1, 1944. Now at this moment, the United States was virtually defenseless. The War and Navy departments were in a panic trying to find enough aircraft to send to the West Coast to defend against an air attack. And General Marshall was about to inform Roosevelt a couple of weeks later in a secret memo that although we thought Oahu was reasonably secure, the Japanese could land at any moment on any one of the other Hawaiian islands and set up aircraft on them, and there wasn't a thing we could do about it. And yet, because of the work that had been done over the last 18 months under Roosevelt's supervision, Knudsen, on December 9th, had predicted the moment at which the decisive offensives against both the Germans and the Japanese were going to begin. That, to me, is one of the greatest achievements in modern history, and it was the reason that there was no end save victory. Thank you very much. Yes?
Do you think Roosevelt knew exactly the attack on Pearl Harbor would occur?
No. I'm sure that he did not know the attack on Pearl Harbor would occur. I think that he was genuinely shocked that the Navy was in port. You see, with 20 years at the Naval War College, I learned a lot. Kimmel committed the unforgivable sin for a naval officer. He was sunk in his mooring. That is the thing that is supposed to be avoided at all costs. Kimmel admitted to one of the actually two of the investigative bodies, yes, if I thought the war was going to break out, I would have had the fleet out at sea.
So how did they know to get the aircraft carriers out of there?
It was a coincidence. The aircraft carriers were taking planes to Guam and Wake to
That's
try to
what
protect
they
them.
That's what they were really after, weren't they? The Japanese?
No, they were not really. I don't think they put that. They would have loved to get them too, but they were happy to get the battleships. Yeah. Yes.
Excuse me, I'm not a historian, I'm just doing this part-time, but there are a couple of points I'd like to bring up. The British historian Arnold Toynbee was once asked what was the most salient fact of the first half of the 20th century. He said that's easy, the Americans spoke English. He wasn't being sarcastic. I think they would have played a tremendous role, for example, in the First World War. Okay? Number two, the 50 older destroyers that America lend and leased to Britain. Did anybody?
No, they didn't lend and lease. They gave those.
It was all, yeah, no.
They gave those away. Yeah.
I know, but was that not an act of war? That was an act of war. In other words, if I give you warships and you're fighting somebody else, I am taking a side. I'm on your side. Number two, the destroyer activity coming out of Halifax to Liverpool and to Belfast. In 1940, there were American destroyers escorting convoys. Okay? That's true.
You would have to document that for me. I don't believe that is true.
Okay, well, take my word.
Sorry, I spent 5 years on this.
I have an honest faith. The imposing of the embargo in July of 1941. Okay?
Yes.
The very next day, I think this was July 12, 1941, the very next day, the Japanese ambassador comes to see Stimson, the Secretary of War, and he says, you tell your president that this cannot be allowed, that this is an act of war. Okay? America was never neutral. America was always taking a pro-British position against this foe, as they saw it. They were looking for a world order, and they were going to play a very, very effective role, including the diminishment of the British colonies, which were all basically abandoned by the 1950-1955, as per other secret agreements. Thank you.
What was your question?
Well,
My question was...
I just want to respond to one aspect of it. No, we were not neutral. We did think the survival of Britain was important, although far from assured. And we did believe that Germany and Japan were at least medium, if not short-term, threats to the United States for which we had to prepare. And I don't see that any of that is anything remotely to be ashamed of. Now, as to many of your specific factual points, no, I'd have to see a lot more evidence on those. But again, the direction of the world for the next half century at least was at stake. And Roosevelt was not going to be a passive observer on that, no. As far as the Toynbee quote, that's what Churchill would have said too.
Yeah.
You say, isn't it great that we sprouted this child, the United States?
And we're both
But no. It is the United States that created modern democracy in the first great crisis with the Constitution. Lincoln, just as much as Roosevelt, saw the Civil War as a test of democracy. What we're fighting for here, he says, is to show that a free government can preserve itself. And this is a test of democracy for ourselves and for the world. And it was seen that way all over Europe, where the liberals and the working classes were rooting for the North and the aristocracy was rooting for the South. And some form of democracy came to all the major European states in the decade after the war, which was not an accident. And again, in the 20th century, Wilson and then Roosevelt were determined that we would prevail. I'm afraid our world leadership is threatened more than anything else right now by the fact that we're not setting a good enough example to inspire anybody to follow it. And that is going to be a huge problem. But let us move forward. Yes?
Do you see any flaw of Roosevelt in the time period you've been talking about? Do you feel there's any flaws in Roosevelt's philosophy, thinking, or whatever?
I suspect that, you see, writing books and, well,
Yeah.
wait a sec. I just want to let you know who you're talking to right now. Researching books is pure joy. Writing them is fun. What happens after you're finished writing, in my experience, is no fun. And one way to defend yourself against that is to get thinking about something new, preferably before the last one's even out, okay? So these matters have not been keenly on my mind for the last 12 months. I've been thinking much more about baseball, which is what my next book is going to be about. But anyway, I'm sure, yes, I'm sure there are places where I thought he made a mistake. But in general, in the broad lines, I have to give him very high marks. And this is what is so extraordinary about him, is that he can think years ahead. And he's clearly thinking years ahead in 1937 and 1938. And that's why he frustrates people like Stimson who want action now. But he understands that we can't now, but we will be able to in a few years if we get ready, and so on. So overall, I have to be very positive. Okay, I think one big mistake they all made had to do with air power and how important it was going to be. And also, I think that it's a very sad fact about the 20th century that by this point, more or less every major power had decided that destroying enemy cities from the air was now part of the game in war, and that there was nothing wrong with that. And I really will always scratch my head over that one, and I hope that that doesn't come back anytime soon. But in general, I would have to give him very high marks, according to any reasonable standard.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Okay, we got a couple more.
Can I make one more point? Neutral point, okay? In 1940, the population of the United States was 130 million. At the end of the war, 15 million Americans were in uniform.
Yeah.
When I was in the Army, I was told, I was an officer in the Army, I was told that for every GI you have on the front line, there are 17 administrative people behind you. Okay?
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons for the very pragmatic reason for the war was employment, healthcare. People for the first time from some areas began to wear shoes. They had dental care, they had eyeglasses. And I think this was all part of this plan. I'm not attributing any pejorative motives to it, but I think it was all part of it.
Well, again, I think that simply continues the spirit of a number of New Deal programs before that, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and National Youth Administration, that yes, I mean, there were large parts of the U.S., particularly in the South, frankly, where people were living in very pre-modern conditions. And again, TVA had a huge impact on that. So yes, the war went along on that, and the war did more than anything else to do that. Actually, going back to the question I was just asked, there are aspects of that era that I find rather scary, in that it was an era of mass production, and all nations, including our own, also regarded people as just instruments of mass production. And that was a large part of what my generation rebelled against, but too much, in my opinion. So in that sense, there are aspects of the era that I don't like. Although I think that they had a lot of things that we have lost and that we are really missing at this time.
Okay, maybe one or two more questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
In looking at your book on Amazon, I read some of the reviews, and there was a one-star review basically criticizing your interpretation of Admiral Kimmel.
You didn't happen to notice who wrote that review,
Yes,
did
the
you?
man's name was Kimmel.
That's right. Yes, now he is the grandson of Admiral Kimmel.
Wow.
And you see, it is the people who, losers always remember wars longer than winners. The Confederate States of America, for instance. And the Kimmel family has been on a crusade for 70 years. They got palsy with Strom Thurmond, that great statesman, and they got some kind of resolution passed because they were the only ones who cared about it anymore, to the effect that Kimmel and Short didn't do anything wrong. But the interesting thing about that is, okay, Thomas Kimmel, who was a retired FBI man who wrote that review, he obviously has a Google alert for his grandfather, because I brought up Admiral Kimmel in my blog, which is called historyunfolding.com. Which I recommend to you. Within 24 hours, he had posted a comment complaining about what I had said. So he's really,
Right up there.
well, if his grandfather had been equally on the alert as he is, history might well have been different. Although actually, that's the other irony. You see, if the fleet had been at sea, it might have been even worse. Because if the Japanese had found them at sea, they would have all gone to the bottom and never come back. Whereas only 2 ships were lost forever at Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
How serious was it with the Japanese coming in on the side of Germany to fight USSR?
Very serious.
Some of the Japanese wanted to do it. But you see, they had actually had a border war in Manchuria in 38 and 39. And the Japanese had basically no armor, whereas the Soviets were already leading the world in armor. And they had come off very badly in that. So there was a major disincentive not to go that way. And they decided it would be better to see if the Germans could handle it and just pick up the pieces.
David, thank you very much.